There's one subject matter that will regularly come up with my clients, and that is attachment. But first, let me explain what attachment is and how it manifests in people's lives. When there's something that we desperately want to have in our life, in other words, we want to manifest something into our life, when we're too attached to the outcome, the opposite actually shows up. So, take for example, we want to manifest more money in our life. If we're too attached to the outcome, our lived experience can actually be that we're manifesting more expenses. And all of a sudden, an expense that we hadn't expected appears and we have to pay for it. So instead of manifesting more money, we're actually manifesting more expenses. The same applies if we take the example that we want to manifest, say, for example, a close relationship with someone in our life. If we're too attached, our lived experience can be that we're all alone and nobody is actually showing up in our life. Or what about when we want more customers or more clients in our business? When we get too attached to what we want and the outcome of what we're actually looking for, what ends up happening is that we begin to lose customers or actually losing clients. Now, we can appear to be doing everything that we've learned, such as visualizing the money or visualizing the relationship or the new clients, but no matter what, we end up with the opposite. The main problem is that we've become too attached to the outcome. We want the outcome too desperately that in fact its opposite shows up in our life. Now, you've probably heard stories from friends or family of someone that wanted the relationship so much that no matter what they did, they still couldn't find that special person to spend the rest of their life with. Or the couple that wanted to get pregnant so desperately, and yet everything that they tried just didn't work. Yet as soon as they gave up wanting to find that special person or to get pregnant, what ended up happening is that they ended up finding the love of their life, or the couple ended up having a baby. Now, we've all heard these stories or similar stories from people that we know. So what's the difference? What did they do differently? How come they ended up with the partner or the baby in these examples? Now, in simple terms, they let go. They let go of the attachment. They let go of wanting desperately for the outcome. Now, there are multiple elements that come into play when it comes to manifesting what we want in our life. And I'm trying to cover as many of these elements as much as I can on these episodes. And there's one in particular that's connected with this particular episode, which I'm going to cover on the next one. And that's about what we focus on. But one of the main reasons why people don't get what they desperately want is because the fact that they're desperately trying to get it. They're not letting go. They're holding on to it too tightly. They have it in their mind that it's to appear in their life in a particular way, and therefore it can only come into their life in the way that they've specified. They're working on how it's going to come about instead of actually just letting it come about. That's the difference. They're trying to control how it's going to happen instead of letting it happen. Now, if you've listened to the previous episodes in this podcast, you'll have heard me talk about the alignment of your executive center to your unconscious and to the superconscious. And I've also talked about taking action on your inspired thoughts. And I talked a bit about how your unconscious will help you to bring about what it is that you want. Well, if you're consciously trying to control everything and how things are to happen and how things are to come about, then absolutely good luck with that one. Because all you're doing is making more work for yourself. Part of the key is to decide what it is you do want and then let it go. If you're holding on to it too much, you're then too attached to it, and therefore what will actually show up is the opposite of what you want. Now, I'm going to explain this in a couple of ways so that hopefully you'll understand what I mean when I talk about attachment. You see, we recently adopted a new dog, and her name is Mocha, and she's a rescue dog, and she's a mix between a German Shepherd and a Collie. Now, she's 18 months old, and she's a pretty big dog. Now, when Mocha wants something that she really wants to have, like on one occasion my wife's shoe, she grabs it and runs off around the kitchen with it in her mouth. Now, when you go and get it back off her, she bites harder on it, so there's absolutely no way that you can have any success in pulling it out of her mouth. Now, remember, she's a big dog, and believe me, she's a lot stronger than anyone else when it comes to trying to pull the shoe out of her mouth. It's just not going to happen, so you end up losing. So here's the trick. Instead of trying to pull the shoe out of her mouth, you have to distract her with a piece of meat. And as soon as she sees the piece of meat, she has to drop the shoe out of her mouth in order to eat the meat, and then you're able to get the shoe back. In other words, she has to let go of what she's holding on to. She has to let go of what she was so desperately trying to hang on to. She has to be distracted by something else. Now, when you're hanging on to something so desperately, like our dog Mocha, you have it tight between your teeth. For something better to show up, you have to let go of what you're holding on to. You, in essence, have to distract yourself. When you're holding on to something so much, not only will the opposite of what you want show up, but all your emotions will be affected too. Now, what will start to show up will be a low emotions like fear and anxiety. And you remember on a previous episode I spoke about how our emotions control us. Now, if we're not getting the money that we want, we'll become more anxious and fear will build up inside us. If we're not getting the new customers or the new clients, we again will become more anxious and fearful. If we're not getting the relationship that we want, we begin to feel despondent and fear that we're going to be left all on our own. So let me tell you what's happening. Again, remember I outlined what the executive code is about, which is to align you to your purpose and to align your executive center to your unconscious and to the superconscious. And by making and maintaining that alignment, you get to live your highest potential. And I also outlined the pendulum, which is the central piece to the executive center, your unconscious and the superconscious. And I explained that in order for that connection to be maintained, then we need to keep the pendulum in equilibrium. In fact, we're always being forced back into equilibrium by the events and circumstances that show up in our life. So when you're attached too much to something, in effect what you're doing is taking yourself out of equilibrium. So in your mind's eye, imagine that the pendulum is swinging to the right, and the more attached you are to something, then the further to the right that pendulum goes. Then what shows up in your life is the opposite of what you desperately want, all for the purpose of bringing you back into equilibrium. So the more you're attached to something, then the more of what you don't want will actually show up in your life. So instead of being attached to the outcome you want, you've got to let it go. Now, in letting go, you're trusting that it's going to come about. You're surrendering it to your unconscious in order for it to come about. Now, this doesn't mean that you're not doing things to bring it about. Of course you are. You have to take the actions. But here's the difference. You're not taking the conscious thinking actions. You're taking the actions from your inspired thoughts. It's the inspired thoughts that are coming from your unconscious. That's where it's so critical to build a connection between your executive center and your unconscious. It all starts with your executive center. That's how life becomes easier. Now, instead of trying to figure it all out for yourself, you follow what you're being guided to. Now, I said in my first book, Evolve, that you never ever worry about the how. In other words, you figure out what it is that you do want, but never about how it's to come about. Otherwise, there's no joy, there's no surprise, there's no fun if you're trying to control everything. When you're attached to something, it's going to bring you out of equilibrium and you'll end up not getting what you want. You'll get the opposite. You've got to let it go. So how do you let it go? Well, each person is different. Each person has their own unique nuances. And it's only by discussing and exploring all the different elements with someone that I determine what's actually really blocking them from letting go and getting what they do want. Now, if you want to find out more about how we can do this, head over to theexecutivecode.com and let's get in touch. In the meantime, ask yourself what it is that you're trying to bring about in your life, but the opposite keeps showing up for you. Is there something that you're trying to bring about and for some reason it just hasn't happened no matter what you do? This will explain a bit about what's actually happening in those circumstances. So, as I mentioned, head over to theexecutivecode.com and let's get in touch. And don't forget, sharing is caring, so spread the word. So share this podcast link with your friends and colleagues. And until the next time, as always, I wish you every success.